Hi, my name is Jacqueline Arazo, and today I'll be presenting on Futurama. We'll be focusing on the episode called Jurassic Park, and I'll talk about the different ethical dilemmas that I've identified. So this is just an overview of what we'll cover. First, I want to talk about the show Futurama, and then go a little bit more into detail about the episode. From there, I want to continue a little bit more with the background information and explain what cloning is. And from there, we can jump into the ethical dilemmas I've identified. One of them being more focused on the bioethics, which is basically just trying to understand, is cloning your pet ethical? And then the other one is more focused on how museums should handle displaying human remains. And from there, I'll talk about why I chose this episode, how it's impacted me, and then I'll just wrap things up. So to start things off, Futurama is an American animated show that was created by Matt Groening. The show follows the adventures of Philip J. Fry, a slacker that was cryogenically preserved for 1,000 years and wasn't revived until the 31st century. He starts working for a delivery company owned by Professor Farnsworth, who turns out to be a distant relative. And there he works with Leela, who's his love interest, and also he works with Bender, a robot that's his best friend. And in this show, I wanted to focus on the episode called Jurassic Park. And the episode begins with Fry and Bender going to a museum exhibit, which turns out to be a pizza restaurant where he worked back in the 21st century. And at this museum exhibit, he finds that Seymour is on display as a fossil. And he tries to take him back home, but he fails. So he ends up protesting for around 3 days, and he finally gets him back. And when he brings Seymour back to Planet Express, Professor Farnsworth tells him that he can basically clone him. And obviously, Fry is super enthusiastic and is super excited. And during all of this, Fry begins to start preparing for Seymour, and over time, Bender gets really, really jealous because he feels like he's going to be replaced by Seymour. So when the cloning process begins and they start getting ready, Bender walks in and he immediately just throws Seymour into a lava pit. And this makes Fry become really distraught and upset. And in this moment, Bender realizes and is able to understand how Fry can love such an inferior creature. And so he jumps into the lava pit and rescues Seymour. So the professor tries to clone Seymour, and the computer tells them that Seymour lived for 15 years. And at that moment, Fry realizes that Seymour continued to live for 12 more years, and assumes that Seymour moved on and found another owner and then lived a better life. So he basically stops the cloning process and he decides not to clone Seymour. And that's when the episode cuts back to a flashback of Seymour waiting for Fry to come back. And he waits and waits in front of the restaurant, never once moving. The seasons pass by and Panucci even closes and Seymour stays there. And so the episode kind of comes to an end where Seymour just kind of lies down and closes his eyes. And we assume that Seymour never really moved on and he spent the rest of his life waiting for Fry. So, in addition to the background information, I wanted to briefly talk about how companies currently clone pets. And basically, what they do is they have this prepared egg cell, which is basically just a typical reproductive egg cell from a dog, and they remove the nucleus and they inject the nucleus with they inject the egg cell with the nucleus that they received from a somatic cell. And basically what that means is that they grab like a tissue sample from the original specimen, they take out a cell, they pull out that nucleus, and that nucleus is injected into the prepared egg cell. From there, they stimulate it, get it to divide rapidly, and at one point it becomes an embryo. And they grab this embryo and implant it into the surrogate mother and hope that it basically takes. And from there, they follow through with a natural pregnancy, and then a puppy is born. And because this puppy has the exact same DNA as the original specimen, it can be classified as a clone. So with this information, I wanted to basically talk about whether or not it's ethical to clone your pet dog, right? And so in this episode, I think it's clear that Fry developed a deep bond with Seymour. It's something that I think we can all relate to, and it's something that is pretty universal. And I think, like any other dog owner, Fry struggles with his own grief about losing his pet. And I think also through Seymour and in the hopes of cloning Seymour, he hopes to kind of gain control over what he's lost from his past life, since he kind of like jumped through time into the 31st century and kind of lost everything he once had. And I think in a way, people who support cloning can understand what Fry was trying to do, because there's actually this actress named Barbara Streisand who wrote an article about her experience cloning her pet. And she basically states that she was really devastated by the loss of her dear Samantha. And after 14 years, she believed it was easier to let Sammy go if she knew she could keep some part of her alive, something that came from her DNA. So basically, Barbara Streisand and other people who are advocates for this kind of view cloning as a way to commemorate their dog passing away. It's a way to kind of like pass the baton and keep their memory alive. And then, of course, advocates state that the process has been studied rigorously for decades, and it's been shown to be safe. While, of course, with every argument, there are people who are against it. And there's this bioethicist named Jessica Pierce who basically argues against it because she states that the cloning industry has produced a whole canine underclass that remains largely invisible to the public and whose bodies serve as a biological substrate. Basically, what she means by a canine underclass is that you need a lot of dogs to clone the original specimen, because not only do you need dogs to extract egg cells, you need dogs to be the surrogate mother. And even the companies themselves admit that this process only has about a 20% success rate. So it takes a lot of dogs to get a clone. And in a way, these surrogate mothers and these dogs used to harvest egg cells, they kind of become machines in a factory. So rather than having the opportunity to live a life as a dog, their whole life is dedicated to just create a product to sell. And also, Jessica continues to state that these companies kind of take advantage of grieving pet owners because they kind of promise to basically replace your dog, but it's impossible to clone a soul. You can clone a body, but not a soul, because even scientists admit that a dog's personality is shaped by their experiences, and it's just impossible to replicate that. So it really comes down to how should people cope with their grief and how should they handle death, and whether or not you should basically clone an animal to be in control of something that is kind of hard to, that's bound to happen, right? Death is something that is always promised. And so that's what it comes down to with this whole ethical dilemma. The next ethical dilemma I wanted to talk about is whether or not it was morally acceptable to display loved ones in a museum, because Fry sees a loved one, right, Seymour, in a museum on full display. So this whole discussion led me to research about exhibition ethics. And exhibition ethics is basically a set of guiding principles on what and how a museum should display different items. And while learning about these issues, it's really hard to ignore how important it is to display human remains. They're still like a vital teaching tool in a lot of different subjects, like in anthropology, archaeology, and even medical sciences. And they also, having human remains on display, help stimulate a learning experience for the public and can help people form a stronger connection to the cultures that are being represented. So with the whole human remains thing, it really comes down to how people view a corpse, right? Some people view the human body and soul as two separate entities. So without a soul, the body just becomes an object. And so these people, they don't really find any problem with displaying the dead, especially if it helps educate the public and kind of helps push our overall understanding and knowledge of the past, the present, ourselves, everything. And even though this is one take on body and soul, it's not really the full picture. We also have people who believe that the body and soul are never separated. Um, these religions can be found within Native Americans, and they have stated that when they see their ancestors on display, they they view it as a way that it's kind of like their tribe is disconnected and torn apart, and that these bodies belong back home, and they view everything intact, right? Every energy, spirits, all of it is all united. So it really shows how different the concept of death is between different cultures. And this is something that museums need to take into place, like into, they have to consider it like into consideration when they make these exhibits. So it's really best for museums to have like a set of ethical principles and have an open door for people to walk in and talk about their own cultures and implement them faithfully and respectfully, because museums not only serve themselves, but they serve everyone that's involved. So I chose Jurassic Park because honestly, it's one of my favorite episodes. It really illustrates how loyal and faithful a dog is. And it's something I can really relate to because I've always had a pet dog. And I think they really showed the story in such a beautiful way, with how even though everyone else moved on, Fry's family, they all made a life for themselves. They all learned how to cope and deal with death. Unfortunately, Seymour kind of stopped living. He kind of had his whole life dedicated for Fry. And I think it's something that is so beautiful and so tragic. And it really makes me and a lot of fans love this episode. So this show impacted me because, well, honestly, studying all of this, cloning, I kind of only viewed it as a way to basically clone tissue samples and be able to study more about the human body. And then there's also like cloning to basically make meat, right? So that we don't have to have all this cattle and use up all of this space. So I never really considered cloning a pet. And I think in a way it made me kind of go against cloning, because I usually am really for it. But when it's to basically replace a loved one and kind of like replace something that's impossible, it makes me really be against cloning. And it shouldn't be, the science and the technology shouldn't be used that way. And then for a museum exhibit, it only reinforced it, because I really do think that museums should totally be culturally sensitive, and they should support and respect the people that they're trying to represent. And so I really do believe museums should have a set of guidelines and principles to properly kind of educate the public. Because as I've mentioned, they're not only serving themselves, they're serving everyone involved. So with that said, I feel like basically death is such a complicated, twisted, crazy thing that I think we all at one point in our lives will have to deal with. And yeah, we all kind of view it differently and we all deal with it differently, but in a way, because it's so universal, we can all come together and empathize and kind of be connected to it. And it's kind of surprising that Futurama can lead me down through all of this, and it's such a goofy show, but it's great to see how something so funny can still hold a lot of depth to it. And thank you for listening to my presentation.